Welcome to Your Daily Audiobook, a place where stories bloom gently in the imagination and where every word opens a doorway into another world. Today, we step into a tale of hidden places, quiet hope, and the magic of growing hearts. It is a story about a lonely house, a locked garden sleeping behind ivy-covered walls, and a group of children who discover that life, love, and courage can awaken even the deepest silence. This is the secret garden retold in a soft, immersive, and emotional way, so you can see every leaf, feel every breeze, and walk beside the characters as the garden slowly comes back to life. Take a deep breath, listen to the wind across the moor, and let the story begin, here on Your Daily Audiobook. Chapter 1. Mary Lennox was not a child people called kind or lovely. She was thin and stiff, with a sharp little face and eyes that always seemed annoyed. She had grown up in a hot, faraway country, in a house where servants hurried around her but no one truly cared for her. Her mother lived for parties and pretty clothes. Her father lived for work and silence. Mary lived somewhere in the middle, mostly forgotten. From the time she was very small, other people fed her, dressed her, and kept her out of the way. If she cried or shouted, someone came running, not out of love, but simply to quiet her. So she learned that if she stamped her feet and frowned, people did what she wanted. She thought this was how the world worked. She commanded, others obeyed, and no one hugged her or asked how she felt. Outside there was a garden with bright flowers and heavy, hot air, but Mary almost never played in it. The sun was too strong, the earth too dusty, and she was not used to running or laughing. Her days were spent indoors, complaining, giving orders to servants, and feeling bored and sour without even knowing why. Then, one strange morning, something changed. The house felt different. There were sudden whispers, rushing footsteps, and frightened voices. The air itself seemed tense. Mary heard doors slamming and someone crying far away. Her nurse did not come to dress her. No one brought her breakfast. The usual sounds of busy life were replaced by a strange, heavy silence. At first, Mary grew angry. She stamped her foot and called for people who did not answer. She walked from room to room, finding them empty. Gardens lay still. Corridors seemed abandoned. The house that had always ignored her now felt completely hollow, like a shell with the life scooped out. She did not understand that an illness had entered the house like an invisible storm. It had swept through the rooms, taking down servants and guests, and finally reaching her parents. No one thought to explain it to Mary. She was simply moved aside, as always. After a long time, a stiff, tired-looking officer found her. He looked at her with strange eyes, as if he did not quite know what to do with such a pale, cross little girl. He spoke quietly with another man, using words Mary did not fully understand. But she caught enough to know that her parents were gone, and they would not be coming back. Mary did not cry. No one had ever taught her how to cry for love, because no one had ever really shown her love. Instead, the news fell into her heart like a stone dropped into deep water. It sank down, and disappeared into a dark place inside her where she could not see it. Days passed in a blur. People sorted papers, locked rooms, and made arrangements. Mary became a problem to be solved, a small bundle to be sent somewhere else. At last, she was told she would go to live with an uncle in a faraway land of mist and rain, in a house that stood on the edge of a wide, wild moor. They said the house was large and mysterious, full of unused rooms and drafts of cold air. They said her uncle was a strange man, often sad, who did not like company and did not understand children. Mary listened with a blank, stubborn face, too numb to be afraid, too proud to show how lost she felt. She did not know that this journey would carry her into a place where the wind sang over lonely fields, where doors hid secrets, and where behind a locked wall, a garden lay sleeping, waiting for someone to wake it up. All she knew was that everything she had ever known was gone. And ahead of her, in a land she had never seen, something unknown was waiting. Chapter 2. The journey to her uncle's house felt long and gray, as though the world itself were slowly folding into silence. Mary sat stiffly in the corner of the carriage, watching the land change around her. The bright sun of her old home had vanished. In its place rose rolling fields, pale skies, and a wind that moved across the earth like a sigh. At a lonely little station, a tall woman in a dark cloak waited for her. She had a firm mouth and sharp, practical eyes. This was Mrs. Medlock, the housekeeper of Misselthwaite Manor. She did not smile when she saw Mary. Instead, she gave a quick nod, as if receiving a package rather than greeting a child. Without much conversation, she led Mary to a carriage. The horse began its slow, steady climb across the countryside, the wheels rattling softly over the narrow road. On either side stretched the moor, wide, wild, and endless. It rolled outward like a great green and purple ocean frozen beneath the sky. The wind ran over it in long breaths, bending the grasses and carrying a faint, lonely sound that seemed part song and part whisper. Mary had never seen anything so empty, yet so alive. Mrs. Medlock talked as they traveled, her voice brisk and matter-of-fact. She spoke of Misselthwaite Manor, a great stone house with countless rooms, long corridors, and corners where no one ever walked. She told Mary that her uncle, Mr. Archibald Craven, was a troubled man who carried sorrow in his heart like a heavy cloak. He did not laugh. He rarely stayed at home. And when he was there, he shut himself away from the world. Mary listened with a tight, thoughtful expression. A strange mix of curiosity and unease began to twist inside her. An enormous house full of empty rooms, a sad, distant uncle, and the wild moor stretching around them like a secret world. It sounded lonely, but also mysterious. For the first time in her life, something inside her stirred that was not anger or boredom. It was the faint beginning of wonder. As the carriage rattled forward, the manor at last appeared through the mist. Misselthwaite rose from the earth like a giant stone creature resting on the edge of the moor. Tall chimneys reached into the pale sky. Rows of windows stared outward like dark, watchful eyes. Thick walls wrapped around the house, as if it had been built to keep the world out, or to keep its secrets in. The iron gates creaked open, and the carriage rolled along a long, shadowed drive. Bare trees lined the path, their branches twisting overhead like bony fingers. When the carriage stopped, the great front door opened with a slow, heavy sound. Servants stood inside, silent and expressionless. No one smiled. No one welcomed her. They only watched. Mrs. Medlock led Mary through dim corridors lined with old portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her. The walls were thick. The ceilings rose high above. The air smelled of stone, dust, and something faintly cold, like a house that had been waiting too long for footsteps to return. Door after door passed them, each one closed. Mary felt as though she were walking through a maze carved from shadows. At last they stopped before a heavy wooden door. "This is your room," Mrs. Medlock said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You will stay here. You will do as you are told. No running about. No wandering where you should not go." Then she left. Mary stood alone in the silent room. A fire burned in the grate, casting soft orange light across the walls. The bed was large and unfamiliar. A window looked out onto the endless moor, where the wind moved like a living thing across the open land. For the first time in her life, Mary felt very small. She did not yet know the house carried stories in its walls, that its locked doors hid forgotten memories, and that somewhere outside, behind stone and ivy and tangled thorns, a secret waited. A secret that would soon begin to call to her, softly, quietly, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. Chapter 3. Mary woke the next morning to the sound of wind pressing against the windows, as if the moor itself were breathing outside her room. The sky beyond the glass was pale and gray, and the house around her felt still and vast, like a sleeping giant. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then the quiet, unfamiliar walls reminded her. This was Misselthwaite Manor. A small fire burned in the grate, and beside it stood a girl with a round face, bright eyes, and a kind, practical manner. Her name was Martha. She wore a simple dress and spoke in a warm, musical voice unlike any Mary had heard before. She talked quickly, as though words came to her as naturally as breathing. Mary stared at her, surprised. Servants in her old life were silent and distant. But Martha spoke as if she were not afraid to be honest. She told Mary that she came from a large, humble family who lived out on the moor, where the wind sang and the earth stretched wide and free. She spoke of brothers and sisters, laughter and work, simple meals and busy days. Mary frowned at first, unused to such talk, unused to anyone speaking so openly in her presence. But as Martha went on, something strange happened. The room felt warmer. The silence in Mary's chest loosened just a little. Martha told her gently that she would not be waited on the same way here. No one would run to her every command. She would have to learn to dress herself, to move, to think, to be curious about the world beyond her bed and her temper. Mary bristled at this at first, but Martha did not argue or scold. She simply smiled in a calm, patient way that made Mary feel both annoyed and seen. After breakfast, Martha spoke of the moor. She said that when the wind blew strong and clear, the heather rippled like a purple sea and skylarks rose into the sky singing bright, wild songs. She said that sheep dotted the hills like white clouds fallen to earth, and that sometimes, if one listened closely, the open land seemed to speak its own language, quiet, ancient, and full of secrets. Mary listened despite herself. The thought of the moor, endless and fierce and alive, stirred something deep inside her, something she had never felt in the hot, crowded world she had left behind. Martha also mentioned the gardens. There were many of them, she said, some tidy, some wild, some hidden behind walls of old stone and thorny vines. Then, almost without meaning to, she spoke of a garden that was locked. A garden no one entered. A garden shut away by Mr. Craven himself after something terrible and sorrowful had happened there. The moment the words left Martha's lips, the air in the room seemed to change. Mary straightened, her eyes sharp with sudden interest. A locked garden. A place no one was allowed to see. A place sealed by grief and silence. Curiosity, unfamiliar and powerful, lit up inside her like a small flame. Martha stopped herself, realizing she had said too much. She tried to turn the conversation away, but the thought had already taken root in Mary's mind. The idea of a hidden garden behind high walls whispered to her like a distant voice calling across the moor. Later that day, Mary was left to wander the house and the grounds under careful instruction not to stray where she did not belong. She stepped outside into the cold, fresh air and felt the wind brush her face like a living hand. The moor stretched endlessly beyond the gardens, wide and mysterious beneath the gray sky. Paths twisted through hedges. Trees creaked softly in the breeze. Somewhere far off, a bird's call echoed through the air. And as Mary walked, her thoughts circled back again and again to the same question: where was the locked garden? What lay sleeping behind its hidden wall? And why did the very thought of it make the air feel full of secrets? The wind moved across the moor, carrying a faint rustling sound, as though something, somewhere, was waiting to be found. Chapter 4. The next days drifted by beneath gray skies and restless winds, and Mary began to wander farther through the grounds of Misselthwaite. At first she walked stiffly, as if every step were an effort. But little by little, the cold air began to color her cheeks, and the wide openness of the moor seemed to stretch something inside her that had long been tight and still. She spent her mornings exploring the gardens. There were many of them, long walks lined with arching trees, flower beds sleeping beneath winter soil, fountains that whispered softly when the wind passed over their stone edges. Some paths were neat and ordered. Others turned wild and crooked, as if nature had begun to reclaim them. As Mary wandered, she noticed how the house looked different from outside. Its walls rose tall and somber, covered in old ivy that clung like green lace to the stone. The windows watched silently over the land, and the chimneys sent faint trails of smoke into the pale sky. No one walked with her. No one hovered at her side. For the first time in her life, she was alone, truly alone, and instead of fear, she felt a strange, cautious freedom. The wind carried whispers across the lawns. Sometimes it sounded like distant singing, sometimes like a sigh, and sometimes like something hidden calling softly from far away. Mary followed the twisting paths, letting curiosity guide her steps. She passed rows of bare rosebushes, their tangled branches sleeping quietly, their thorns glinting in the thin light. She walked beneath old archways, alongside stone walls, and past locked doors that led into tool sheds and forgotten corners. Everywhere she went, she searched for clues. A locked garden, a wall covered in ivy, a gate no one could see. The thought pulsed in her mind like a quiet drum. One afternoon, she saw a gardener working near a cluster of tall trees. He was an old man with a wrinkled face, a thin mouth tucked into a half-smile, and eyes that held a spark of something sharp and knowing. His back was bent, his clothes worn, and a small red-breasted robin fluttered nearby as if it belonged to him. This was Ben Weatherstaff. He spoke in a rough, grumbling voice that sounded like stones rolling in a shallow stream, but there was something kind beneath the roughness, something as old and steady as the earth itself. He barely looked at Mary at first, yet the robin perched boldly on a branch above them, tilting its head and watching her with bright curiosity. Mary stared at the bird. It was small but full of life, its chest glowing like a tiny ember against the cold gray day. When it hopped along the branches, it seemed to carry joy in its wings. Mary felt something lift inside her as she watched it. Without realizing it, she smiled. Ben noticed he muttered that the robin was a cheerful creature, always nosing about, always finding secrets in the gardens. He called it his friend, though he pretended not to care too much. Mary felt drawn to the little bird, as if it understood more than it could ever say. The robin fluttered to another branch, chirping softly, almost as if it were speaking to her. Mary took a small step closer. It did not fly away. Instead, it hopped toward the old wall behind the trees, its wings flickering lightly as it disappeared into a tangle of ivy. Mary's heart leaped. A wall, hidden beneath climbing vines. Her eyes followed the line of the stone, tall, silent, wrapped in twisted leaves and thorny branches. The air around it felt different, heavier somehow, as though the place held a breath it had been saving for years. She stood very still. The robin chirped again from somewhere beyond the curtain of ivy, a soft, beckoning sound that trembled through the quiet air. Something waited there. Something forgotten. Something sealed. Mary felt the wind brush against her cheek like a whispering voice. And for the first time since she arrived at Misselthwaite, she felt the thrill of a secret beating just beneath the surface of the world. What lay behind that wall? Why did the robin watch her so closely? And what story did the sleeping garden hide within its tangled vines? The more wind rose and carried the questions away. But the answer, Mary sensed, was closer than ever. Chapter 5. The next morning broke cool and pale, with a thin mist drifting across the gardens like a quiet veil. Mary woke with a strange kind of excitement stirring inside her, a feeling she had never known before. It was not anger, not boredom, not stubbornness. It was curiosity, warm and bright, like a small lantern lit deep in her chest. She dressed herself more quickly than usual and slipped outside. The air smelled of damp earth and leaves. The wind moved softly across the lawns, carrying with it the distant cry of birds and the faint, faraway breath of the moor. Mary followed the winding paths without quite meaning to, as if her feet already knew where she wanted to go. The robin was waiting. It perched on the top of a broken branch near the ivy-covered wall, its red chest glowing gently in the morning light. When it saw Mary, it tilted its head and gave a bright little chirp, as if greeting an old friend. Then it fluttered to another branch, a little farther along the wall. Mary followed. Her heart beat softly in her ears as she walked beside the long stretch of stone, her fingers brushing against the cool leaves that tangled across its rough surface. The ivy clung thickly to the wall, twisting and curling as though it meant to hide everything beneath it. The robin hopped again, closer still, and let out a sudden, quick trill. It was as though it were guiding her. Mary stopped. Something glimmered faintly beneath the ivy. She pushed aside a trailing vine, her small hands trembling. Leaves rustled softly around her fingers. And there, almost lost among the tangled growth, something cold and smooth brushed against her skin. A metal ring. Her breath caught. She pulled the ivy farther back, and the ring revealed itself fully, rusty and old, attached to something buried deep in the wall. A latch. A hidden door. For a long, fragile moment, Mary could not move. The world around her seemed to go still. The wind paused, the robin fell silent, even the sky felt watchful. Her heart fluttered like a small bird trapped inside her chest. Very slowly, she wrapped her fingers around the ring. It felt heavy, ancient, as if it had not been touched by human hands for years and years. Ivy roots tugged gently at it, as though reluctant to let it go. Mary took a slow breath and pulled. The latch creaked. The sound was low and secret and full of time. Then came the faint scrape of a lock turning, and the door stirred. The wall itself seemed to sigh. Mary pushed. The door swung inward, and a breath of cool, sweet air drifted out, air that smelled of earth, leaves, hidden roots, and something faint and mysterious, like a memory of flowers sleeping beneath the soil. She stepped inside. Beyond the wall lay a garden unlike any she had ever seen. Tall trees stretched their branches overhead like quiet guardians. Twisted, leafless vines wrapped around stone arches and old wooden frames. Beds of plants lay silent beneath blankets of fallen leaves, waiting in stillness. Thorny rosebushes curled into dark shapes, their branches tangled together like sleeping creatures. Everything seemed asleep, not dead, not forgotten, only waiting. The garden felt alive in silence. Mary stood in the center of it, her face soft and wide-eyed, her heart beating with awe. The air around her felt warm and secret, like a place that had been holding its breath for a very long time. This was the locked garden. The forbidden garden. The garden no one was meant to enter. And yet, here she was. The robin fluttered past her and landed on a low branch nearby, watching her calmly, as if it had led her here on purpose, as if it had been guarding the place until someone came who was willing to listen. Mary knelt beside one of the beds and brushed aside the dry leaves. Beneath them, she saw tiny threads of green, small shoots pushing bravely up through the dark earth, reaching for light that had not yet arrived. A feeling bloomed inside her, gentle, hopeful, trembling. This garden was not dead. It was sleeping. It was waiting to wake. She pressed her hand softly to the ground, as though promising it something she did not yet have the words to say. The wind moved softly through the branches above. The garden seemed to listen. And Mary knew, with a certainty that filled her whole being, that everything in her life was about to change. Somewhere, deep within the tangled vines and quiet roots, a new beginning had just taken its first breath. And the question rose inside her like a whisper: what would happen now that she had found the secret, and stepped inside its sleeping heart? Chapter 6. The garden wrapped itself around Mary like a quiet dream. Each day, when the sky was pale and the wind moved softly across the moor, she slipped through the hidden door and into the secret world beyond the wall. She carried no toys, no books, no servants' voices, only her curiosity, her small hands, and the strange new warmth growing in her chest. Inside, the garden still looked asleep, but not lonely anymore. She began to notice things she had not seen at first. Tiny green shoots pushing bravely through dark soil. Buds curled tightly on thorny branches, as if whispering to the coming spring. Twisted vines lifting themselves inch by inch, reaching for light. The more she looked, the more alive everything seemed, as though the ground itself was listening for footsteps and waking up slowly beneath them. Mary had never cared for anything before. But here, she wanted to. She knelt beside the beds and brushed away fallen leaves with careful fingers. She tugged gently at dead stems and broken twigs, making space for new growth to breathe. She did not know exactly what she was doing, but the work felt right, like helping something small and fragile stand again. Sometimes the robin followed her, hopping across branches and stones, watching her with bright, curious eyes. It chirped softly, darting from place to place, as though showing her where to look. Mary spoke to it in a low voice, shy at first, then warmer, telling it what she saw, what she hoped might grow. For the first time in her life, her voice sounded gentle. Outside the wall, Mary began to change. Her cheeks grew rosier, her eyes brighter, her step lighter. Instead of drifting through the house with a frown, she rose early, eager to feel the cold air on her face and the soft earth beneath her shoes. She no longer complained out of habit. The world felt wider now, and she felt, in a strange new way, awake. One afternoon, while wandering along the paths, she found a small, rusty garden spade and a trowel tucked behind an old shed. They were worn and scratched, but sturdy. Mary held them in her hands like treasure. She carried them into the secret garden. She dug gently around the roots where the earth looked tight and tangled, loosening the soil so that new life could rise more easily. The smell of freshly turned dirt filled the air, rich, deep, and hopeful. Every tiny sprout she uncovered felt like a discovery. Every patch of sleeping roots felt like a promise. Sometimes she imagined the garden listening to her. Sometimes she imagined it smiling. When she grew tired, she sat on a stone bench beneath the tangled vines and looked around in silence. The branches overhead stretched like arms across the sky. The bare roses rested against one another, their thorns sharp, their stems waiting. The air felt warm even in the chill breeze, as though the garden itself carried a quiet, sleeping heart. Mary thought of Martha's stories. Her big, lively family. The moor. The laughter. The simple meals and hard work. A world so different from the stiff, empty life Mary had always known. For the first time, she wondered what it might feel like to belong somewhere. To be part of something living. The thought frightened her and thrilled her. Later that day, when she left the garden and closed the hidden door behind her, she felt the secret settle softly inside her like a small glowing light. She said nothing to anyone. Not to Martha. Not to the servants. Not even to Ben Weatherstaff and his grumbling voice. This garden was hers, and somehow she felt the garden belonged to her as well. But as she walked back toward the house, the wind rose on the moor and carried a strange sound across the air, faint, distant, almost swallowed by the walls. A sound like a cry. Not the cry of a bird, not the cry of the wind. A human cry. Mary stopped. The sound faded, then returned, soft and mysterious, echoing through hidden corridors and unseen rooms. She stood very still, her pulse quickening. What, or who, was hidden in this house, just as the garden had been hidden behind its wall? And why did the sound seem to be calling to her? Chapter 7. That night, the wind pressed hard against the walls of Misselthwaite Manor, and the long corridors filled with shadows that stretched across the floors like silent rivers. Mary lay in her bed, the fire flickering softly in the grate, but sleep would not come. The sound she had heard earlier still echoed in her mind, that strange, distant cry that did not belong to wind or bird or storm. It returned. Soft at first. Then clearer. A faint, lonely weeping hidden somewhere deep inside the vast house. Mary sat up. Her heart beat fast, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. She slipped out of bed, wrapped herself in a robe, and pressed her bare feet against the cold floor. The room felt suddenly small, and the corridor outside seemed to whisper her name. She opened the door. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and endless, lit only by the faint glow of drifting lamps. The walls were lined with old portraits, stern faces, soft faces, sad faces, all watching silently as she stepped forward. The air smelled of stone and dust and secrets. The cry came again. Somewhere far down the corridor, beyond turn after turn, hidden behind doors that had always remained closed. Mary followed the sound. Her footsteps were quiet, like a small echo following the larger echo of the house itself. She turned corners, past tall windows where the moonlight fell cold across the floors, and listened with every fiber of her body. At times the sound faded, as if swallowed by the halls, then suddenly grew louder again. It was not a ghostly wail, not wild or frightening. It was the cry of someone in pain. Someone lonely. Someone alive. At last she reached a heavy door at the end of a narrow passage. The sobbing came from behind it, soft, broken, and close. Mary hesitated only a moment before lifting her hand and turning the handle. The door creaked open. Inside, the room glowed with the faint light of candles. The air smelled of medicine and faint perfume. The walls were draped with heavy curtains, and near the center of the room stood a large bed with tall wooden posts and thick coverings. On the pillows lay a boy. He was about Mary's age, thin and pale, with dark shadows beneath his eyes and hair that fell across his forehead like a soft curtain. His face was beautiful in a fragile, sorrowful way, like a flower grown in darkness. His eyes were filled with tears. When he saw Mary, he gasped, just as surprised as she was. They stared at one another in silence. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, the boy asked who she was, and how she had found him. Mary stepped into the room, her curiosity sharp and bright. She said simply that she heard someone crying, and followed the sound. The boy blinked, astonished. He told her his name. Colin. He said he was Mr. Craven's son. Mary felt a strange shiver pass through her, not of fear, but of discovery. She realized this boy was the secret the house had been hiding. The hidden voice behind the walls. The sorrow at the heart of Misselthwaite. Colin lay back against his pillows and spoke in a proud, fragile voice. He said he was ill. He could not walk. He rarely left his bed. The servants tiptoed around him. doctors whispered about him. He believed he would grow weaker and weaker until Mary saw, beneath his anger and fear, a loneliness as deep as her own once had been. He had lived surrounded by people, and yet completely alone. Just like her. The house was silent around them, as if listening. Mary stepped closer. Her heart softened, and something inside her shifted, like a locked door quietly beginning to open. She did not know that this meeting would change everything, not only for Colin, but for herself, and for the sleeping garden waiting behind its secret wall. Because from this moment forward, 3 lives, hers, Colin's, and the garden's, were no longer separate. They were about to grow together. And somewhere deep within the walls of Misselthwaite Manor, a new secret began to bloom. Chapter 8. The candles flickered softly in Colin's room, casting long shadows across the walls and making the air feel thick with silence. Mary stood beside the great bed, studying the pale boy who stared back at her with a mixture of surprise, irritation, and something fragile and hidden beneath his sharp tone. He was not used to visitors. He was not used to being looked at as if he were real. Colin lifted his chin and spoke with the air of a tiny king trapped in velvet and pillows. He said that everyone in the house believed he was weak, delicate, and doomed to grow sicker with every passing day. The doctors whispered. The servants pitied him. His father, unable to bear the sight of him, stayed far away, lost in sorrow and fear. So Colin lay alone in this great quiet room, surrounded by shadows and worry. Mary listened closely. She realized that Colin, like her, had been raised inside walls built not of stone, but of loneliness. He had been given everything except the one thing that mattered: warmth. The fear that surrounded him had become a cage. He believed every frightened word spoken about him, and every sad thought spoken near him. Mary did something no one else had done. She did not treat him like a fragile glass figure. She spoke to him plainly. Her voice was steady, not fearful. She told him about the moor, about Martha and her cheerful chatter, about Ben Weatherstaff with his wrinkled scowl and sharp eyes, and about the robin who hopped and sang among the trees as if the whole world belonged to it. Colin's eyes widened slightly. The outside world was something he had only heard in passing, through whispers, reports, and careful words. But Mary spoke of it like color after darkness, sound after silence, life after stillness. He leaned closer on his pillows without realizing it. He listened. Then, curious and suspicious all at once, he asked Mary if she often explored the grounds alone. His eyes narrowed, searching her face as though she were hiding a treasure. Mary felt a flutter in her chest. The secret garden pulsed in her mind like a heartbeat. She hesitated. Her silence made the moment tremble. Colin demanded to know why she paused. Mary did not reveal the garden, not yet. Instead, she spoke carefully, saying there were many walks, many paths, many corners of the grounds filled with quiet beauty and sleeping earth, places that felt full of mystery and possibility. Colin's face changed. For a breath, he looked younger, softer, like a boy who wanted desperately to run and shout and breathe open air, but could not. Then, as quickly as it came, the softness vanished. He grew tense. He spoke of illnesses, of bones that might twist and break, of doctors who predicted the worst and servants who believed every fearful word. His hands trembled. His eyes filled with sudden panic. He believed he would not live long. Mary felt anger spark inside her, not at him, but at the fear that surrounded him like a heavy fog. She told him firmly that he looked no more dying than she did. Her voice, though small, rang through the quiet room like a bright bell. Colin stared at her, stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not with scolding. Not with pity. but with honesty. A strange, delicate silence fell between them. The wind outside brushed softly against the windows, as if pressing its ear against the glass to listen. Somewhere deep in the house, a floorboard creaked. The night seemed to hold its breath. Then Colin did something unexpected. He smiled, just a little. It was small, unsure, but real. The moment shimmered like the first tiny leaf breaking through winter soil. The candles burned low. The shadows deepened. Mary did not yet know that this quiet spark, this tiny smile, was the beginning of something greater than either of them understood. Two lonely hearts had found each other. And beyond the walls, in the sleeping garden, something felt the change, and stirred softly beneath the earth. Chapter 9. The house slept deeply that night, its long corridors wrapped in stillness, but Mary's thoughts did not rest. Even after she returned to her room, Colin's pale face and bright, troubled eyes lingered in her mind. She had never met anyone so angry and frightened, yet so breakable and proud all at once. It was as if he lived inside a cage built from worry and shadows, a cage everyone around him helped to keep shut. The next morning, the moor wind swept over the grounds with a cool, lively breath. Mary dressed quickly and slipped outside, feeling the pull of the secret garden like a quiet thread tugging at her heart. The door hid behind its curtain of ivy, waiting. When she stepped through, the world inside greeted her with soft silence, and the faint scent of earth waking beneath the soil. The garden felt different now. Warmer, more alive. Tiny blades of green pushed through the dark ground. Buds on the rose bushes had grown rounder, as if lifting their faces toward a sun they believed would soon arrive. The branches still looked twisted and bare, yet they whispered with promise, like sleeping creatures on the edge of dreams. Mary knelt with her small spade and began to work. She cleared leaves from the roots, loosened the soil, and brushed away dead stems with gentle hands. She moved carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid to disturb something sacred. Every breath she took filled her with a feeling she could not name, a feeling soft and brave at the same time. She was not just playing. She was caring. The robin darted through the branches above her, hopping from twig to twig, watching her with bright, knowing eyes. It chirped, as though pleased with her efforts, as though it understood that the garden was no longer alone. Mary lifted her head and whispered to it. She told the robin about Colin. She spoke softly, as if confiding in a trusted friend, about the boy hidden in his room, trapped by fears and guarded by silence. She told the bird that he seemed like a plant that had been shut away from light for too long, growing pale and fragile in the dark. The robin tilted its head, listening. A strange thought fluttered into Mary's mind. What if the garden could help him? What if the air, the sky, the green shoots waking from sleep, what if all of it could breathe life into him, the way it had begun to breathe life into her? The idea settled inside her like a tiny, glowing seed. Later, when she returned to the house, the corridors no longer felt as hollow. The silence seemed different, less empty, more waiting. She felt stronger, steadier, as if the garden had woven sunlight into her bones. Mary went back to Colin's room that evening. He looked pale and restless again, his face lined with worry, but when he saw her, a faint light touched his eyes. He asked sharply why she had not come sooner, as though afraid she might vanish like everything else that brought him comfort. Mary did not scold him. She told him about the gardens, all of them, and spoke especially of fresh air and hidden corners where the earth felt full of life and mystery. She did not yet speak of the secret one behind the wall, but the thought of it shimmered in her voice. Colin listened hungrily. He imagined wind in the branches, sun on the stones, and birds singing above tangled vines. His face softened, his breathing slowed. For a brief moment, he forgot his fear. Then a servant entered and mentioned doctors. The air darkened. The word wrapped around Colin like a shadow. His shoulders tensed. His eyes filled with dread. He spoke again of illness and weakness, of bones and pain and endings he believed were already waiting. Mary's heart tightened. She wanted to shake the fear away, to tear down every terrible whisper that had been planted in his mind. Instead, she spoke gently but firmly, telling him that life did not feel like sickness out on the moor, that hope, like green sprouts in winter soil, could rise where no one expected it. Her words lingered between them like soft light. Colin looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then, in a voice barely more than a breath, he asked her something, not in anger, but in longing. What if there truly was a place where things could come alive again? The question trembled in the air. Mary felt the secret garden press against her heart. The time was coming. Soon, she would have to decide. Would she keep the hidden place to herself, her treasure, her refuge, or would she open its door to someone whose life had never once known sunlight or growing things? Outside, the wind whispered across the moor, and somewhere behind the silent wall, the garden seemed to wait for her answer. Chapter 10. The sky above Misselthwaite stretched pale and wide, and the moor breathed softly under a cool morning wind. Mary woke with a feeling of restless purpose, as if the day itself were urging her forward. The secret garden tugged at her thoughts, and Colin's frightened eyes lingered in her mind like a question she could not ignore. After breakfast, she slipped outside and hurried along the familiar winding paths. When she reached the hidden door and pushed it open, the garden welcomed her with its quiet, waiting warmth. The earth beneath her feet felt softer than before, the air richer, as though life was gathering its strength beneath every root and branch. She knelt and began her small, careful work. Leaves brushed aside. Soil gently loosened. Sleeping stems given space to breathe. While she worked, she spoke aloud, not to anyone she could see, but to the garden itself. She told it about Colin. About his lonely room and shadowed thoughts. About the fear that wrapped around him like thick vines choking out light. She told the garden that he needed something strong and real, something that could show him the world was more than illness and whispered dread. The wind moved softly through the branches overhead, and Mary felt, in a strange, quiet way, as if the garden understood. The robin hopped close, chirping brightly, and Mary smiled. The sound filled the air like a tiny bell of hope. She lifted her face to the sky and felt a warmth rise inside her, not from sunlight, but from something new waking in her heart. Kindness. Care. A wish for someone else to grow, too. That afternoon, while the house lay hushed and heavy, Mary returned to Colin's room. He was lying among his pillows, pale and tense, his eyes clouded with worry. When he saw her, some of that tension eased, as though her presence carried a small light into the room with it. She sat beside him and began to speak. Not of doctors. Not of illness. But of growing things. She told him about the tiny green shoots she had found beneath fallen leaves, about the vines stretching slowly upward, about the buds curled tight like secrets waiting for warmth. Her voice flowed gently, like a stream moving through quiet stones. Colin listened without blinking. His breath deepened. His face softened. For a moment, the shadows around him faded. Then Mary said something she had not said before. She spoke of a garden, a place hidden and forgotten, wrapped in walls and vines, where everything lay sleeping beneath the earth, waiting for someone to wake it. She did not yet say it was real, but she described it as if she had seen it with her own eyes. Because she had. Colin's heart stirred. He asked her, in a trembling voice, if such a place could truly exist, a place where life returned after long silence, where something believed lost could begin again. Mary looked at him carefully. She felt the secret rise inside her like a bird beating its wings. And she made a choice. Yes, she said softly. Such a place existed. A garden that was not dead, only waiting. Colin's eyes shone, bright with wonder and hunger, as if a door inside his heart had opened a little. He clutched the blanket in his hands, and for the first time, hope, fragile and trembling, flickered across his face. But then fear returned. He whispered that even if such a place existed, he could never see it. He said his body was weak, his bones fragile, his fate already sealed by every fearful word spoken around him. The room seemed to grow smaller. Mary leaned forward. Her voice, though quiet, rang with new strength. She told him that gardens did not bloom by listening to fear, they bloomed because something inside them chose to live. Colin stared at her, as if hearing a new kind of truth for the first time. The candles burned low. The room held its breath. Somewhere, far beyond the walls, the secret garden stirred in its sleep, as if it, too, was waiting for the moment when the boy behind the curtains would finally step beneath its sky. And Mary knew. That moment was coming. Soon. Chapter 11. The days began to fold softly into one another, and with each passing morning the more wind seemed to blow more gently across the gardens, as if carrying with it the first quiet promise of spring. Mary felt stronger, brighter, and more alive than she had ever felt before. The secret garden had become the heart of her days, and Colin had become the thought that rested quietly beside it. She returned to the garden early, when the air still carried a faint chill and the sky hovered between gray and pale gold. As she slipped through the hidden door, the world inside greeted her with a peaceful hush. The earth felt warmer beneath her feet. The buds on the branches looked fuller, as though they were listening for the moment when the world would finally wake. Mary moved from bed to bed, her hands gentle and steady. She brushed aside fallen leaves, loosened old roots, and whispered softly as she worked, as though speaking to the garden itself. She did not know why she did it, only that it felt right, like part of the magic of waking things up. Ben Weatherstaff appeared near the wall that morning, his wrinkled face sharp as ever, his eyes full of watchful suspicion and quiet curiosity. He pretended to scold, muttering about meddling hands and stubborn little girls, but his voice carried a softer edge than before. The robin fluttered above them, bright and spirited, singing as if it were pleased with everything that was happening. Mary asked careful questions. She wanted to know more about the garden that had been locked, about the sorrow that once lived here, about the people who had loved this place so deeply that losing it had broken something inside them. Ben's voice grew low. He spoke of a woman who had once walked these paths with laughter in her eyes and warmth in her smile, a woman who loved roses and sunlight and the soft sound of the wind through the branches. He spoke of how this place had been her joy, and how, after tragedy struck within its walls, the garden had been closed like a wounded heart. Mary listened without speaking. She felt the story sink into her like roots reaching deep into soil. The garden suddenly felt even more sacred, not just a secret, but a memory wrapped in vines and earth. When Ben left, the robin flew closer, hopping from branch to stone, watching Mary with bright, trusting eyes. She smiled softly and whispered that the garden would bloom again, not just for the woman who had loved it, but for the people still living who needed its magic. Her thoughts drifted to Colin. Later that day, she went to his room. The moment she entered, his eyes lit, not wildly, not desperately, but softly, like a candle touched by a gentle flame. He asked about the garden again, his voice trembling with longing and half-belief. This time, Mary did not speak in riddles. She told him the truth. She told him that the garden was real, hidden behind high walls, still and silent, but full of sleeping life waiting to rise. She told him that she had found the key, the door, the paths, the vines, the beds waking under her hands. Her words carried the scent of fresh earth, the breeze of the moor, the bright flutter of the robin's wings. Colin listened as if each word were a breath of air he had been starved for. His face changed, fear still clung to him, but hope now stood beside it, fragile and shining. He asked, in a whisper that trembled like a leaf in wind, whether he might one day see it. Mary's heart beat fast. She saw how much it meant to him, how deeply he longed to step into the world she described, to feel sunlight on his face and wind in his lungs, to stand beneath branches that stretched toward the open sky. She also saw how fear chained him, how every voice around him had taught him to believe in weakness instead of possibility. Mary made another choice. She told him he would see it. Not someday. Not in a dream. Truly. Colin stared at her, wide-eyed, as if a door had swung open inside him. Outside, the moor wind rose and brushed softly against the walls. Inside, something awakened, in him, in her, and in the quiet space between their hearts. The garden was no longer just a secret. It was a promise. And the world, silent and watchful, waited for the moment that promise would be fulfilled. Chapter 12. A soft brightness touched the edges of the days that followed, as if the world itself were slowly awakening from a long winter dream. The moor stretched wide beneath a sky that seemed a little clearer, the wind carrying a fresh scent of damp earth and distant blossoms not yet born. Inside Misselthwaite Manor, the halls still echoed with silence, but for Mary and Colin, something had changed. Hope had begun to move quietly through the air. Mary returned each morning to the secret garden, carrying her small tools and the quiet determination blooming in her heart. When she opened the hidden door, the garden greeted her like a breath of warm air rising from deep soil. The branches overhead seemed fuller. The buds trembled slightly, plump with life, as though the promise of spring had settled into every sleeping root. She worked carefully, loosening soil and clearing paths where tangled stems had fallen across one another. Each small task felt meaningful, as if her hands were helping the earth remember how to live again. Sometimes she knelt so close to the ground that she could see the smallest green threads pushing upward, tiny shoots that seemed fragile and brave all at once. The robin stayed near her as always. It darted from branch to branch, its song bright and cheerful, as if cheering her on. When it paused and tilted its head toward her, Mary sometimes whispered to it, words she would never dare say aloud to anyone else. She spoke of Colin, of his pale face and frightened eyes, and of her wish to bring him here someday, beneath this open sky. It felt like sharing a secret with the garden itself. That afternoon, she returned to the house with soil still clinging softly to her fingertips and warmth glowing in her cheeks. The corridors no longer felt as cold or endless. Instead, they seemed like passages leading from one quiet heartbeat to another, from the garden's sleeping life to the hidden life in Colin's room. When Mary entered, she found him sitting more upright than before, his eyes alert, his expression restless with curiosity. The room still smelled faintly of medicine and shadowed air, but there was something new inside it, an invisible spark that flickered between them the moment she stepped through the door. He asked at once about the garden. His voice trembled, not with fear this time, but with longing. Mary told him everything she had seen that morning, the tiny shoots lifting from the soil, the buds swelling on the branches, the air rich and warm with life still hidden but on its way. She spoke of the robin's bright song, of the sunlight filtering through tangled vines like golden thread. Colin listened as though every word filled him with breath. For a moment, his face glowed with wonder, and then a shadow crossed it. He looked down, his thin hands twisting into the blankets. Doubt crept back into his thoughts, whispering the same old fears. He said he would never be strong enough to walk there. He said his body was weak, his back fragile, his future already written in whispers and fearful looks. He spoke the words of others, words he had heard for as long as he could remember, until they sounded like truth. Mary felt something fierce rise inside her. She did not shout. She did not soften her words. Instead, she told him firmly that life did not belong only to those who were already strong. She told him the garden itself had once been locked away, forgotten, and left to sleep, and still, it was waking. Still, it was returning to life. If the earth could rise again, why couldn't he? Her words hung in the air like bright sunlight pushing through a cloud. Colin stared at her, stunned, uncertain, and then, slowly, a spark lit his eyes. Not certainty. Not confidence. But something small, something new. Possibility. He whispered, almost afraid to hear his own voice, that perhaps, just perhaps, there was more inside him than weakness. The room fell silent. Outside the window, the wind swept across the moor, carrying with it the faint rustle of distant branches, as if the world beyond the walls were calling to him. Mary watched him closely. Colin lifted his head. And in that fragile moment, where fear and hope stood side by side, she knew the time was drawing nearer. A day was coming when he would have to choose, remain inside the darkness of his fears, or step, trembling but alive, toward the garden waiting beneath the open sky. Chapter 13. The morning sky hung low and pale, and the moor wind drifted softly through the air like a quiet promise. Mary felt a flutter of determination inside her as she walked along the stone paths outside the manor. The thought of Colin no longer filled her only with worry. It now carried a sense of purpose, like a door slowly unlocking within both of their hearts. She wanted him to see the world beyond his room. She wanted him to feel the breath of the wind, the warmth of earth, the quiet magic of living things. That day, as she slipped through the hidden door into the secret garden, the world inside greeted her with a deeper stillness than before, not empty, not silent, but waiting. The buds on the rose branches were swelling softly, round and hopeful, as if they were listening for the moment when life would finally bloom again. The grass beneath the trees glowed faintly with small patches of new green. Mary knelt in the soil and worked with gentle hands. She loosened clumps of earth around tender shoots. She cleared away twigs and old leaves from the edges of the flower beds. With every small movement, she felt as though she were helping the garden breathe, slow, deep breaths rising from the ground like a soft awakening. The robin watched her from a nearby branch, singing a bright and cheerful song that echoed lightly through the air. Sometimes it hopped down to the stones beside her, tilting its head as if checking her progress, as though it too were part of the work taking place here. Mary paused. She closed her eyes for a moment and listened. The garden did not speak in words, but still, it seemed to speak. In the rustle of vines, in the soft tick of branches touching one another, in the quiet hum that lived beneath the soil. It felt alive. Alive, and calling for more than just one small girl to hear it. She stood slowly and looked around. The stone benches, the arching vines, the silent trees, all of it seemed to whisper the same thought: this place was meant to be shared. The idea settled into her heart like a seed taking root. Colin must come here. Not someday. Not if he grew stronger. Not in a story. But truly. He must sit beneath these branches, breathe this air, lift his face to the sky as the buds opened all around him. Mary knew he was frightened of standing, of moving, of the shadows that doctors and servants had placed in his mind, but she also knew that staying hidden in darkness was not the same as being safe. Sometimes, light was the only cure. Later that afternoon, she returned to the manor. The corridors felt different now, not cold, not distant, but full of possibility, like long tunnels leading towards something bright just beyond reach. When she entered Colin's room, she found him sitting up, his eyes wide with restless anticipation. He asked about the garden before she had even opened her mouth. Mary smiled, not proud, not secretive, but calm and steady. She told him the truth of what she had seen that morning. The swelling buds, the stirring earth, the color slowly returning to sleeping branches. As she spoke, the room seemed to fill with breath, as though the air itself grew warmer. Colin listened as if every word reached a place inside him that had long been locked away. His hands trembled on the covers. He said he wished, more than anything, that he could be there. Under the open sky. Where life was waking, and where fear felt small and far away. Mary felt courage rise inside her. She leaned closer. And in a voice filled with quiet strength, a strength she had never known she possessed, she told him that he would go there. Not as a dream. Not as a distant wish. He would go. His breath caught. He stared at her, uncertain, afraid, hopeful all at once. Shadows clouded his thoughts, whispering doubt, but another feeling trembled beneath them, a feeling he did not yet know how to name. Before he could answer, the wind outside rose suddenly and brushed against the windowpane with a soft, restless sigh, as if the world beyond the walls was calling his name. The sound lingered. The room fell still. And Colin looked toward the window, as though something, far beyond his fears, had just awakened inside him. Chapter 14. The wind moved gently across the moor that morning, carrying with it a cool, stirring breath that slipped through cracks and corridors and found its way into Colin's quiet room. Mary felt the change the moment she entered. The air no longer felt heavy with silence. It felt expectant, like a hush before something important begins. Colin was sitting upright among his pillows, his eyes bright and restless. There was a nervous glow in his face, like a small flame trembling in uncertain hands. When he saw Mary, he did not complain or sigh. Instead, he asked, almost in a whisper, whether the garden still waited. Mary nodded. She saw the fear in him, but she also saw the spark beneath it, the tiny, fragile courage trying to wake inside his heart. Martha came into the room soon after, carrying fresh linens and speaking cheerfully about the day. Colin watched her carefully, listening to the warmth in her voice, the strength in her steps. For a moment he seemed to see something new, a world beyond fear, where people worked, laughed, lived, and did not tremble with every breath. Martha mentioned her brother. A boy who ran across the moor like the wind itself, who climbed hills and spoke to birds, who loved the open sky more than walls or roofs. His name was Dickon, and Martha said he had a way with growing things, that animals trusted him, that plants seemed to wake under his care, that the earth itself listened when he spoke. Mary's heart stirred. She remembered the garden, the sleeping vines, the rising shoots, the small lives pushing through soil. And she remembered Dickon's name like a warm promise whispered across the fields. Colin listened with wonder, his eyes wide. A boy who was part of the moor, part of the wild, part of the living world he had never been allowed to touch. For the first time, envy did not twist inside him, longing did. Mary spoke carefully. She said that Dickon knew the languages of growing things, that he understood the quiet music of roots and leaves, that animals followed him as if he were part of nature itself. The thought wrapped gently around Colin's imagination like light. He asked whether Dickon might ever come to see him. His voice trembled, hopeful, frightened, uncertain. Mary hesitated. She thought of the secret garden, and the garden's magic, fragile and waking. She thought of Colin, pale and lonely, and how desperately he needed something real, something alive, something that breathed hope instead of fear. She said that perhaps, one day, Dickon might help in a place where things were learning to live again. Colin's breath caught. He leaned back slowly, his eyes shining with a dream he was almost afraid to believe in. For a long while, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly in the grate. The wind brushed against the windows. The world outside the walls seemed closer than ever, almost within reach. Later, when Martha left the room, Mary leaned nearer to Colin. Her voice softened. She told him there was a kind of magic in the world, not the kind of magic found in spells or glittering charms, but the quiet magic of life itself. The magic that wakes seeds beneath the earth. The magic that lifts branches toward the sky. The magic that turns fear into strength when hope is allowed to breathe. Colin listened with wide, serious eyes. He whispered that if such magic existed, perhaps it lived inside him too, hidden and waiting, like the garden behind the wall. Mary did not answer. She only looked at him, and in her silence he felt the truth. Outside, the moor stretched wide, patient and watchful. Inside the secret garden, small unseen buds tightened with quiet anticipation. And somewhere between fear and courage, something new began to rise in Colin's heart. The day was coming. Soon, the boy who had lived his life behind curtains and shadows would face the moment where dreams, fear, hope, and magic would meet beneath the open sky. And nothing, would ever be the same again. Chapter 15. The morning light crept softly across the sky, touching the moor with a gentle silver glow. The air felt calm, yet full of quiet energy, as though the world itself knew that something important was slowly drawing nearer. Mary walked through the corridors of Misselthwaite with steady steps, her thoughts echoing with dreams of vines, soft earth, and the sound of wind breathing through branches. She had made up her mind. Colin must see the garden someday, truly see it, and she knew she could not bring that day alone. The garden needed more than one pair of small hands. It needed someone who understood growing things with a kindness deeper than words. Someone like Dickon. That afternoon, Mary went out across the grounds, where the moor stretched wide and free beneath the pale sky. The air smelled of cool grass and damp soil, and the wind drifted softly over the hills. As she followed a winding path toward the trees, she saw him. Dickon walked with an easy, quiet grace, as if he belonged to the earth itself. A small fox trotted at his side. A bird perched calmly on his shoulder. The animals moved with him, not out of fear, but out of trust, as though they knew his heart. Mary called his name. He turned, and when he smiled, the world seemed to warm a little. They walked together among the soft grasses, and Mary began to speak. Her voice trembled at first, filled with caution and excitement. She told him about the wall covered in ivy, the rusty ring hidden beneath the leaves, the door that creaked open with a breath of old air. She told him about the secret garden. Dickon's eyes widened. Not in surprise, not in fear, but in wonder. He listened quietly as Mary spoke of sleeping rose branches, tiny green shoots rising from dark soil, and a hush in the air that felt full of waiting. The wind brushed across the moor as she spoke, and for a moment, it seemed as though even the sky was listening. Then Mary asked the question she had carried in her heart. She asked whether he would come. Not only to see the garden, but to help wake it. For a long, thoughtful moment, Dickon did not answer. He looked out across the moor, where the grasses trembled like waves beneath the wind. Then he nodded, not with excitement, but with deep, gentle understanding. He said that a place like that should live again. Together, they walked to the hidden door. Mary pulled the ivy aside. The latch creaked softly, and they stepped inside. The garden opened before them like a sleeping dream. Vines curled across arching branches. The earth rested dark and rich, with tiny threads of green rising here and there like whispered hopes. The air felt warm and still, as though the garden recognized them. Dickon stood very still. His eyes softened, filled with quiet awe. He knelt beside one of the small shoots and touched the soil with gentle fingers, as if greeting an old friend who had been waiting a long time. He spoke softly, not to Mary, not to himself, but to the garden. Mary watched him. She felt as though the earth itself leaned toward him. Together, they began to work. They cleared tangled leaves, loosened stubborn roots, and lifted fallen stems with care. The robin fluttered overhead, singing brightly as if delighted to see two pairs of hands tending the waking garden. As they worked, Mary spoke of Colin. She told Dickon about the pale, lonely boy hidden away in a room full of shadows and fears. She spoke of his longing for life, his trembling hope, his fragile heart afraid to believe in strength. Dickon listened quietly. He did not laugh. He did not doubt. He only nodded, slow and thoughtful, as though he already understood. He said that some things, people, gardens, hearts, only needed patience, warmth, and a little bit of magic to grow strong again. Mary felt the truth of his words settle deep inside her. The garden seemed to glow faintly in the soft air, as if responding to every gentle movement, every hopeful thought, every breath of care. A promise rooted itself quietly in the soil. They would wake the garden. They would help it bloom. And one day, Colin would walk beneath its branches. The wind drifted through the vines with a soft whisper, a sound that felt like the beginning of something new, something brave, something alive. Chapter 16. The next morning rose with a pale glow spreading gently across the sky, and the moor breathed softly beneath a drifting veil of cool air. Mary felt a quiet excitement blooming inside her as she walked toward the secret garden with Dickon beside her. The world seemed full of soft colors and faint rustlings, like everything was slowly stretching and waking after a long sleep. When they opened the hidden door, the garden greeted them with warm stillness. The buds on the branches looked larger, their rounded shapes full of promise. Tiny leaves had begun to unfurl like shy little hands opening to the sky. The earth smelled rich and deep, and the air carried a faint sweetness, not yet flowers, but the almost of flowers. Dickon smiled. He moved through the garden as if he understood every whisper of leaf and root. He spoke gently to the shoots rising out of the soil, to the vines curling up the stones, to the small blades of grass finding their way toward the light. His voice was calm and warm, and the garden seemed to listen. Mary worked beside him. She felt stronger than ever before. Her hands were steady. Her breaths were full and deep. The quiet girl who once lived inside frowns and anger now moved with purpose, guided by care instead of bitterness. The robin hopped near them, chirping bright notes that fluttered softly through the air like scattered sparks of joy. It hopped closer to Dickon than it ever had to anyone but Ben Weatherstaff, as though it recognized a friend of the garden, someone who belonged here. As they worked, Mary spoke more about Colin. She told Dickon how fear wrapped around him like thick curtains, how the servants whispered and stared, how the doctors spoke with heavy, hopeless voices. She told him that Colin believed his body would fail him simply because everyone insisted it would. Dickon listened, quiet and thoughtful. He said that sometimes, when a plant grows in darkness, it bends toward the smallest hint of light, and can still become strong if it is given warmth, care, and space to live. He looked at Mary with gentle eyes. He said that Colin might be like such a plant. Mary felt a tremor of hope rise inside her. They spoke then of magic, not the glittering kind told in fairy tales, but the deep, invisible magic woven into living things. The kind that makes seeds wake beneath the earth, that pushes branches toward the sky, that turns silence into song when the world is ready to grow again. Dickon said that maybe this magic lived inside people, too. Inside gardens. Inside hearts that had forgotten how to open. Mary thought of Colin lying in his shadowed room, and she felt it was true. The afternoon sun slipped softly through the tangled branches, casting golden lines across the ground. The air hummed quietly with life waiting to bloom, and for a moment, the garden felt like a secret dream beginning to breathe. Then Mary made a promise out loud. She said Colin would come here. She said they would bring him beneath the branches and into the warm, waking air, even if fear trembled in his voice, even if doubt tugged at his thoughts. Because the garden was not only for her. It was meant for him, too. Dickon nodded with calm certainty. He said they would help him, together. The wind brushed through the vines, carrying a soft, hopeful whisper across the garden. The tiny buds trembled, as if they, too, were listening. The world inside the wall no longer felt like a place in hiding. It felt like a heart slowly opening. And beyond the stone and ivy, in a quiet room filled with shadows and wonder, a lonely boy waited, unaware that life, warmth, and magic were already moving toward him, step by gentle step, ready to change everything. Chapter 17. The sky above the moor was soft and pale, and a gentle breeze drifted through the air like a whisper of new beginnings. Mary walked through the long corridors of Misselthwaite with a sense of steady purpose in her heart. The house no longer felt like a maze of cold rooms and shadowed halls. It felt like a path leading towards something bright and living. Today would be different. Today, she would help Colin take his first true step toward the world beyond his fears. When she entered his room, the curtains were drawn back just enough for a narrow beam of light to spill across the floor. Colin sat upright among his pillows, his face pale but alert, his eyes filled with a restless spark that had not been there before. He did not complain. He did not scold. He waited. Mary spoke gently, her voice steady and warm. She told him the garden was waking more each day, that the buds were swelling, the grass lifting, the vines stretching toward the sky. She told him the air there felt alive, as if hope itself was growing in the soil. Colin listened without breathing. Then, very quietly, Mary asked him if he would like to feel the air for himself. Not as a wish. Not as a dream. But truly. A silence filled the room. Fear flickered in his eyes. The memories of whispered warnings and frightened glances clung to him like dark threads. His hands trembled over the blanket, and for a moment, he looked as though he might retreat back into the safety of his shadows. But another feeling trembled beneath the fear. Desire. Longing. He wanted to live. Slowly, carefully, he nodded. Martha and a servant came to help, their faces cautious and uncertain, but Mary's voice remained calm. She guided them with quiet firmness, as if she carried certainty inside her chest. They lifted Colin gently into a wheeled chair, his body fragile, his breath shallow, yet his eyes shining with something brave and new. The chair rolled forward. The corridor stretched ahead, long, silent, watchful. With every turn, Colin's heart pounded like a drum. The world he had never known unfolded around him, tall windows filled with pale light, tapestries whispering from the walls, distant echoes of footsteps far away. He had lived in this house his whole life. Yet he was seeing it for the first time. Mary walked beside him. She did not pity him. She did not treat him like glass. She treated him as someone who could. Step by silent step, they reached a door that led out to the grounds. When it opened, a breath of fresh air flowed in, cool, clean, filled with the scent of open space. Colin closed his eyes. The wind brushed his face. His lips parted in wonder. For a moment, he did not feel weak. He did not feel trapped. He felt alive. They moved slowly across the path that wound between hedges and tall trees. The world outside was vast and quiet, birds singing softly in distant branches, the moor stretching far beyond the gardens like a great, breathing sea. Every sound, every movement, felt miraculous. Mary led the way with calm confidence, and Dickon waited nearby, smiling with gentle warmth, as steady and welcoming as the earth beneath their feet. His presence was like sunlight through clouds, soft and reassuring. Colin watched him with awe. He saw a boy who did not fear the wind or the sky, a boy whose heart beat in rhythm with the living world. For the first time, Colin felt the distance between fear and life grow smaller. They did not yet take him through the hidden door. Not today. Today was the beginning. Today, the world outside had met him, and he had not broken, had not withered, had not collapsed beneath the weight of his fears. He had breathed. He had lived. As they turned back toward the house, the wind swept softly through the branches overhead, carrying with it the faint whisper of the garden hidden behind the wall. Waiting. Listening. Calling. Colin closed his eyes, and the sound of that distant, sleeping place echoed in his heart like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Chapter 18. The morning sky shimmered softly with pale light, and the moor stretched wide beneath a quiet breeze that carried the faint scent of awakening earth. Mary walked toward the garden with steady steps, her heart lifted by the memory of Colin's first breath of open air. Something had shifted inside him, and inside her as well, like two seeds beginning to sprout at the same time. When she slipped through the hidden door, the garden welcomed her with warm stillness. The buds on the rose branches looked fuller than ever, their curved shapes swelling with quiet promise. Small leaves had begun to open like soft green wings, and the ground glowed with tiny shoots rising bravely from the dark soil. The whole garden felt as though it were whispering one single word, soon. Dickon was already there, kneeling near a patch of earth where new growth trembled in the light. A soft smile touched his face, and the robin hopped beside him, singing a bright, hopeful melody. The air around them hummed with life, invisible yet powerful. Mary joined him, her hands moving with gentle certainty as they worked side by side. They loosened roots, lifted fallen stems, and cleared space for the new life pushing upward. Each small movement felt like part of a promise not only to the garden, but to Colin as well. Mary spoke softly while they worked. She told Dickon about the way Colin had breathed the outdoor air, about how his face had changed, how his eyes had filled with wonder instead of fear. She spoke of the courage trembling inside him, fragile, yes, but growing. Dickon listened with quiet warmth. He said that when a bird first leaves its nest, its wings shake, but the shaking does not mean it cannot fly. It only means the bird is learning to trust the strength already inside it. Mary felt those words echo inside her. They worked in peaceful silence for a while. The sunlight slipped gently through the tangled branches overhead, casting golden patterns across the paths. The wind brushed softly through the vines, and the garden seemed to breathe with them, slow, deep, steady. Then Mary spoke the thought she had been carrying in her heart. She said it was time. Time for Colin not only to breathe the outdoor air, but to see the secret garden. The words trembled softly between them, like a leaf shaking on its stem. Dickon did not look surprised. Instead, he nodded gently, as though he had known this moment would come, as though the garden itself had been waiting for it. He said the boy must come here not to watch others live, but to begin living himself. Mary felt a warm, steady courage fill her chest. Later that day, she returned to the manor. The corridors no longer seemed heavy and cold. They felt like bridges leading from darkness to light. When she entered Colin's room, she found him sitting straighter than before, the color in his face faint but real, as though a small flame had begun to glow beneath his skin. His eyes lit the moment he saw her. He asked about the garden, the real garden, the one behind the wall, the one that lived in every word she spoke. Mary drew closer. She told him that the time had come. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Now. He would go there. The room fell still. The faint ticking of the clock softened. The air seemed to hold its breath. Fear rushed into Colin's eyes, but so did hope. His hands trembled on the edge of the blanket. He whispered that he was afraid of falling, of pain, of failing the hopes he hardly dared believe he had. Mary did not deny his fear. She placed her hand gently on the arm of his chair and spoke with quiet strength. Courage, she said, was not the absence of fear. Courage was choosing life in spite of it. For a long moment, Colin stared at her. Then he nodded. Not in certainty, but in faith. A trembling, fragile, beautiful faith. Outside, the moor wind stirred softly, brushing against the walls as though urging him forward. Somewhere beyond the house, behind stone and ivy and sleeping branches, the garden waited. Alive. Listening. Ready. And the path between fear and wonder had finally begun to open. Chapter 19. The sky hung soft and pale above the moor, and a faint golden light touched the tops of the distant grasses, as if the world itself were gently guiding the day forward. Inside Misselthwaite Manor, the halls felt different, not gloomy, not empty, but quiet in a listening way, as though the house understood that something important was about to happen. Mary stood beside Colin's chair, her heart steady and warm. Dickon waited near the doorway, his calm presence filling the room like sunlight after a long clouded morning. His gentle smile carried no doubt, only quiet trust in the garden, in the air, in life itself. Colin's hands trembled slightly on the arms of the chair. His face was pale, but his eyes were bright, full of fear and longing woven together like two threads that could not be separated. He looked at Mary, then at Dickon, then toward the window where the light stretched softly across the glass. He nodded. It was a small nod, fragile, uncertain, but it was enough. Martha and a servant helped lift him carefully into the wheeled chair. Every movement made his breath catch, but he did not call for them to stop. There was determination inside him now, a quiet flame he refused to let go out. The chair began to move. Out of the room. Down the long corridor. Past portraits and tapestries and tall windows filled with pale sky. The house watched in silence. Each turn of the wheel carried Colin farther from the world of shadows he had always known, and closer to the breath of the living world waiting beyond the door. At last they reached the outer passage. The door opened. A rush of fresh air drifted in, cool, clean, carrying the scent of grass, soil, and distant heather. The wind touched Colin's face like gentle fingers. His eyes widened. He inhaled slowly, and for a moment, his fear loosened. They rolled across the path. Birdsong echoed softly in nearby branches. The moor stretched far beyond the gardens, its wide, endless space filled with quiet strength. The world did not tremble around him, and neither did the sky fall. He was not breaking. He was living. Mary walked beside him in silence, knowing words would only scatter the fragile courage he was holding so carefully inside himself. Dickon guided the chair with a steady hand, leading them along a path hidden between tall hedges and curling branches. The air grew warmer. The wind softened. A wall of ivy rose ahead, tall, silent, wrapped in green and brown leaves that trembled gently in the breeze. Mary's heart began to pound. They stopped. For a moment, no one spoke. The world stood still. Mary stepped forward and brushed the ivy aside with familiar hands. The rusty ring glimmered faintly beneath the leaves. She curled her fingers around it, feeling the cold metal press into her palm. The latch creaked, slow, secret, full of memory. The door opened. A breath of warm, earthy air flowed out, rich with soil and new life, with quiet promise and sleeping beauty beginning to wake. They crossed the threshold. The garden spread before them like a dream finally spoken aloud. Branches arched overhead, dotted with opening leaves. Small shoots rose bravely from the soil. Buds swelled on tangled rose stems, not yet flowers, but so close, as if the world were on the edge of blooming. Sunlight filtered softly through the vines, painting the ground with golden threads. Colin stared. His eyes filled, not with tears of pain, but with wonder. He lifted his face to the open sky. The breeze brushed his hair gently, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. A sound escaped his lips, not a cry, not a gasp, but a soft breath of disbelief. It was real. The garden was real. Alive. Waiting for him. The robin flew past in a bright flutter of wings and landed on a nearby branch, chirping a clear, joyful note, as if welcoming him into its world. Colin gripped the arms of the chair. His fear loosened. His heart opened. And somewhere deep within the soil, beneath roots and sleeping seeds, something answered him, something warm and ancient and alive, a magic not of spells or fairy dust, but of life itself beginning again. The air shimmered softly around them. The garden had woken. And now, it began to wake him, too. Chapter 20. The garden wrapped itself around them like a warm, breathing world, full of light and quiet promise. Colin sat very still in his chair, his eyes wide and shining as he took in every branch, every sprout, every tender shape of green pushing out of the dark soil. The wind moved softly through the vines, and the robin sang from a high branch, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. For a long while, no one spoke. Mary watched Colin closely. His pale face looked different in the open air, softer, brighter, touched by the faint glow of golden light that filtered through the tangled branches above. His lips parted slightly, as though he were afraid that if he breathed too deeply, the garden might vanish like a dream. Dickon knelt beside a patch of earth where tiny leaves trembled in the breeze. His voice was low and gentle as he spoke to Colin, not in pity, not in fear, but in steady kindness. He said the plants were only just beginning to wake, that their roots were stretching and their stems were learning to stand, little by little. Just like him. Colin listened. The words settled inside him like seeds falling into warm soil. Mary knelt beside a rosebush that curled upward in twisted, sleeping branches. She brushed away old leaves and whispered softly, as though the plant itself could hear her. Then she turned to Colin and told him that these bushes had once looked broken, but now they were full of hidden life, waiting for the right moment to bloom. Colin's hands trembled on the arms of the chair. He looked down at his thin legs, then back at the rosebush, at the buds that had not yet opened, but would, in time. Dickon's eyes sparkled gently. He said that the garden was full of magic, not the kind found in stories, but the deep, quiet magic that lives in every living thing. It was the magic that made seeds swell beneath the earth, that called birds to the sky, that turned fear into strength when hope was finally given space to breathe. Colin lifted his head slowly. His breath shivered. He whispered that maybe that same magic lived in him too. The words sounded fragile, but brave. Mary nodded. She told him that life was growing everywhere in this garden, and that life did not stop at the edge of the soil. It moved through roots, through branches, through hearts that had been shut away for far too long. The wind brushed gently across Colin's face. For the first time, he did not shrink from it. He leaned into it, just a little. Dickon placed one hand on the back of the chair and asked softly if Colin would like to try something small. Not standing. Not walking. Just a tiny movement, a promise to himself that he could be part of this growing world. Colin swallowed. Fear fluttered through him like a frightened bird trapped inside his chest. But beneath it, something steadier pulsed. He tightened his hands around the arms of the chair. Very slowly. Very carefully. He lifted his body forward, just enough that his back no longer rested fully against the pillows. His arms trembled. His breath shook. But he did not fall. He did not break. He did not collapse beneath the weight of his fear. He held himself there. Alive. Mary's eyes filled with astonished warmth. Dickon's voice grew bright with quiet pride. The robin sang a sharp, joyful note from the branch overhead, as if the garden itself were cheering. Colin sank back into the chair, his chest rising and falling with deep, trembling breaths. Then, a smile broke across his face. Not small. Not weak. A real smile. The kind that carried wonder. The kind that carried strength. He whispered that he would try again. Tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that. The garden seemed to glow in the soft afternoon light, as if every leaf and every bud had heard his promise. The air pulsed with quiet magic. But as the wind drifted across the walls and slipped back toward the manor, Mary felt a faint shiver pass through her, not of fear, but of something unknown approaching, distant yet moving closer. Something, or someone, whose presence might soon change everything. The garden breathed softly around them, and the promise of what was yet to come lingered in the air like a secret not quite spoken. Chapter 21. The days that followed seemed to glow with a quiet, spreading light, as if the garden's awakening had begun to seep into every corner of Colin's heart. Each morning, the sky above the moor stretched soft and bright, and the wind carried the gentle scent of warming earth. Mary and Dickon brought him to the secret garden again and again, and each time he crossed the threshold, the world felt a little wider, and Colin felt a little stronger. The buds on the rose branches had begun to swell with color. Tiny leaves opened like soft green hands reaching toward the sun. Grass shimmered in faint patches of bright new growth. The garden no longer felt like a place merely waking, it felt as though it had begun to live. Colin's spirit woke with it. He asked questions, curious, eager questions, about roots and branches, about birds and wild creatures, about the wind and the sky and how everything in the garden seemed to know when it was time to grow. Dickon answered with gentle patience, his voice warm and steady, as though he were part of the very earth he spoke about. Mary watched Colin closely. His pale face carried more color now. His eyes glowed with courage instead of fear. When he lifted himself forward in the chair, just as he had promised, his arms still trembled, but his heart did not. The robin fluttered overhead, singing bright, dancing notes that echoed through the garden like tiny bells of joy. Sometimes it hopped boldly near Colin's feet, as though testing whether he truly belonged here. And little by little, he did. One afternoon, sunlight spilled softly across the stones near the center of the garden. Dickon stood beside Colin's chair and spoke quietly, his words as gentle as the breeze. He asked if Colin would like to try something more, not a great leap, not a bold step, only a small, brave moment. Colin stared at the ground ahead of him. His fear stirred, a faint, familiar tremor, but it did not rise like a wave to drown him. Instead, another feeling rose beneath it, solid and bright. He nodded. Dickon steadied him. Mary stood close, her heart beating fast. Very slowly, Colin placed his feet upon the soft earth. His legs trembled like thin branches in the wind, but they did not give way. His hands rose from the arms of the chair. His body lifted, uncertain, shaking, determined. For a breathless moment, he stood. The world fell silent. The wind paused in the leaves. The robin froze upon its branch. The garden held its breath. Colin swayed, but did not fall. His eyes filled with astonished light, and a sound escaped his lips, half laughter, half wonder, as if he could not believe what his own body had done. He stood. Alive. Growing. Changing. Like the garden. Mary felt tears rise, not of sadness, but of joy so bright it ached. Dickon's face glowed with quiet pride. The robin burst into a thrilling, jubilant song, scattering music into the air like sparks of living sound. Colin lowered himself carefully back into the chair, breathing hard, but smiling wider than he ever had before. He whispered that the magic was real, alive in the garden, and alive in him. Mary did not argue. She believed it too. The sun slipped lower in the sky, painting golden light across buds and branches that trembled with promise. The garden felt larger than walls, larger than roots and stems, as though it reached beyond stone and sky to something deeper than either of them had ever known. But as they left through the hidden door, a shadow brushed softly against Mary's thoughts. Not a dark shadow, but a quiet one. Somewhere beyond the garden, in distant corridors, in rooms filled with old memories and quieter sorrows, someone else had begun to feel the faint stirring of change. Someone who had spent years walking through life with a heart sealed like a locked door. And soon, the garden's secrets would reach him, too. Chapter 22. The days unfolded like soft petals opening to the sun, and the garden grew brighter with every passing morning. The buds on the rose branches swelled until color glowed faintly beneath their delicate skins, and the air began to hum with a gentle warmth that wrapped itself around every leaf and stone. Colin's strength grew with the garden. Each time he returned, he stood a little longer. His legs still trembled, but now the trembling felt like part of growing rather than part of breaking. His laughter echoed beneath the branches, light and surprised, as though he were discovering joy for the very first time. Mary felt pride awaken quietly inside her. Not pride in herself alone, but pride in the garden, in Colin, in the life that had begun to bloom where fear once lived. She watched him lift his face toward the sky and breathe deeply, as if filling his chest with wind and sunshine and hope. Dickon moved through the garden with his calm, gentle grace, guiding without pushing, encouraging without demanding. He spoke softly to the plants, to the robin, to the small creatures that darted here and there beneath the leaves, and somehow, he also spoke to Colin's spirit without using many words at all. The three of them did not feel like strangers anymore. They felt like roots of the same growing thing. The robin sang more boldly now, hopping close to Colin's chair as if testing whether the boy had at last become part of the place it guarded. Sometimes it fluttered above his head in bright, circling lines, and Colin laughed with such joy that the garden itself seemed to sparkle. They began to talk about magic often. Not fairy tale magic, not charms or spells, but the deep, quiet magic of life itself. Colin believed in it now with his whole heart. He said it lived inside the soil, inside the sky, inside every green shoot and every beating heart that chose to hope instead of fear. He said it lived inside him. Mary listened, and realized she believed it, too. One afternoon, when the light was warm and golden, Colin looked at Dickon and Mary with fierce determination. His eyes shone, not with fear, but with courage that glowed bright and steady. He said he would walk. Not only stand. Not only lift himself. Walk. Mary's heart tightened. Not with doubt, but with awe. Dickon stepped beside him, hands ready yet gentle. Colin gripped the arms of the chair, took a deep breath, and slowly, carefully, rose to his feet. The ground beneath him felt real, solid, alive. He took one small step. Then another. The world did not fall apart. His body did not fail him. He moved, unsteady, trembling, wavering, but moving all the same. Mary covered her mouth, tears burning softly in her eyes. The robin burst into bright, triumphant song, as if the garden itself were singing with him. The wind swept gently through the vines, and the sunlight wrapped around him like a warm embrace. Colin took another step. Then another. He laughed, a clear, ringing sound full of wonder, courage, and new life. He said the magic was working. He could feel it in his bones, in his breath, in the earth beneath his feet. He was no longer only a boy in a chair. He was a boy learning how to live. They rested after a while, sitting together on a stone bench beside a bed of waking roses. Colin's face glowed with tired joy. Mary leaned close, her heart full and bright, while Dickon sat quietly nearby, smiling as though he were watching the earth itself bloom. The garden felt whole, alive, awake. But far beyond the wall, across quiet rooms and lonely halls, another heart had begun to stir as well, a heart wrapped for many years in sorrow and silence. And without knowing it, that heart was already being called back to life, by the same quiet magic that now blossomed under the open sky. Chapter 23. The morning air shimmered softly with the warmth of approaching spring, and the garden glowed beneath a sky brushed with faint gold. Roses swelled in tight, hopeful buds. The grass shone fresh and bright, and the vines along the stone walls rustled gently in the breeze, like the soft whisper of voices long asleep beginning to wake. Mary and Dickon brought Colin to the garden every day now. He no longer looked like a boy hidden inside fear. His eyes sparkled with life, his cheeks carried a warm flush, and his steps, though small and careful, had begun to grow steadier. Each time he walked, he felt stronger, as if invisible roots were forming beneath his feet, connecting him to the earth and the sky and everything living around him. The garden was no longer only a secret. It had become a sanctuary, a place where hearts healed, and where hope grew like sunlight through leaves. One afternoon, after Colin had walked farther than ever before, the three of them rested on a stone bench beneath arching branches. The air felt full of light, full of quiet magic, full of something rising within them that none of them could quite name. Colin lifted his face to the sky. His voice trembled, not with weakness, but with awe. He said the magic of the garden was real, so real that it lived not only around them, but inside them. He said it flowed through roots and branches, through wind and earth, and through their own hearts, as if they were part of the very life that made the world grow. Mary listened, her heart swelling with something warm and bright. She realized that the frightened, angry child she had once been no longer lived inside her. The garden had changed her too, had softened her, opened her, filled her with care and courage and wonder. Dickon smiled quietly, his calm eyes reflecting the peace of the garden itself. He said that when people believe in the life around them, and inside them, they begin to grow in ways they never thought possible. He said that the earth held a quiet strength, and now, so did Colin. The robin fluttered above them, circling joyfully before landing on a nearby branch. Its song lifted through the air like a bright ribbon of sound, as if it were celebrating along with them. Colin spoke again, his voice stronger now. He said that one day, he would show everyone who believed he was weak, that he was not. He would run across the grass, stand tall beneath the sky, and prove that he was alive, truly alive, not only in his body, but in his spirit. Mary felt a thrill of pride and hope surge through her. For the first time, Colin did not speak like a boy trapped in shadows. He spoke like someone building his own future. But even as they laughed and dreamed beneath the waking roses, a quiet awareness stirred in Mary's thoughts. Beyond the garden walls, far across the moor and through winding paths of memory, Colin's father still walked with a heart weighted by sorrow. He did not know of the laughter echoing beneath the branches. He did not know of the boy who had begun to stand and walk and dream. He did not know that the life he believed lost was waking, growing, returning. The wind brushed softly through the vines, carrying the faint echo of Colin's laughter outward, across the grounds, across the moor, and toward a lonely, wandering heart that was closer to the garden than any of them yet realized. Chapter 24. Far beyond the walls of Misselthwaite, across wide stretches of moor and winding paths of wild grass, a man walked slowly beneath a sky streaked with soft clouds. His shoulders were bowed, as though he carried a weight that had lived inside him for many years, a weight made of sorrow, memory, and silence. This was Mr. Archibald Craven. His heart had long been shut like a locked door. He wandered from place to place, never able to rest, never able to stay. The world felt empty to him, as if the brightest part of his life had been taken away, leaving only shadows behind. He traveled endlessly, hoping that distance might quiet his grief, but wherever he went, the sadness followed. On this quiet day, he walked through a strange and beautiful garden far from home, where the air smelled of flowers and warm soil. Sunlight filtered gently through leaves, and a soft breeze brushed his face like a memory he could not quite grasp. He paused near a cluster of blooming trees. The branches swayed lightly above him, and for a brief, trembling moment, he felt as though someone he once loved stood beside him, as if laughter still lived in the air, as if joy had only been sleeping rather than gone. His chest tightened. He closed his eyes. And then, something stirred inside him. A sound, distant, gentle, carried through memory rather than space. It felt like a child's voice, soft and clear, full of hope and life. It echoed faintly in his heart, like a bell ringing far across the moor. He did not understand it. But the moment wrapped around him like warm light. He felt as though he were being called, not by grief, not by sorrow, but by something alive. Something waiting. Something he had not felt in many years. He turned toward the sky. The wind shifted. Somewhere deep within him, a thought rose, fragile at first, then stronger. He must go home. Not out of duty. Not out of habit. But because something, or someone, seemed to be calling him back to Misselthwaite, back to the moor, back to a place he had once loved and feared to remember. He began his journey. Days slipped by as the land changed around him. The air grew cooler. The sky stretched wider. The moor spread out like a great, breathing sea beneath drifting clouds. With each step, the weight in his heart felt as though it might be lifting, not gone, not healed, but shifting, like a door beginning to open after years of silence. At last, he reached the long, lonely road that led to Misselthwaite Manor. The great stone house rose in the distance, tall and solemn against the sky. Its walls watched silently over the land, just as they always had, but something felt different now. The air around it seemed warmer, lighter, touched with an invisible glow. He stood at the edge of the grounds and listened. And there, faint and far away, drifting across the wind and through the gardens and walls, came a sound. A laugh. Light. Clear. Alive. A laugh full of joy and strength and wonder. His heart leapt. It was a sound he had never expected to hear again, a sound he believed belonged only to memory. His steps quickened. He moved across the path, past hedges, past trees, past quiet corners of the grounds he had avoided for so long. The laughter came again. Not sorrow. Not illness. Not fear. Life. Alive. Growing. Calling him closer. The wind swept softly across the moor, carrying the bright sound toward him like a guiding thread, and Mr. Craven followed it, breathless, trembling, toward a place he had locked away in grief. Toward a garden. And toward the miracle waiting behind its hidden wall. Chapter 25. The sky above Misselthwaite glowed softly with late afternoon light, and the breeze moved gently across the moor like a quiet song. Inside the secret garden, laughter echoed beneath the branches, bright, warm, alive. Roses trembled in their swelling buds, and the grass shimmered with soft green light, as if the earth itself were smiling. Colin stood near the center of the garden. Not in his chair. Not supported by fear. He stood on his own. His thin legs trembled, but his posture was proud and steady, his eyes shining with wonder and fierce joy. Mary stood nearby, watching him with a heart full of awe, while Dickon smiled calmly, as if he had always known this moment would come. The robin flew in a bright circle above them, singing a bold, triumphant song. Colin lifted his face to the sky and laughed, a clear, ringing laugh that bounced against the garden walls and rose into the open air. It sounded like the laughter of someone discovering life for the very first time. He took a step. Then another. The ground beneath his feet felt firm and real. The world did not crumble. His strength did not vanish. He walked. Slowly. Carefully. Beautifully. Mary's eyes filled with tears she did not try to hide. Dickon watched in silent pride, his calm smile glowing with quiet happiness. The garden seemed to hum with soft magic, as though every leaf, every vine, every waking rose whispered encouragement. Colin stopped near a stone bench and rested his hands upon it. His breath came quickly, but there was no fear in his eyes, only triumph. He whispered that he felt alive. Truly alive. The words shimmered in the air like sunlight. Mary told him gently that he was alive, just as the garden was alive, just as the moor was alive, just as every living thing that chose to grow rather than wither was alive. Colin closed his eyes. He felt the wind brush his face, the warmth of the garden wrap around him, and the quiet pulse of strength inside his own body. For the first time in his life, he believed in himself. He believed in his body. He believed in the magic of growing things. He believed in life. He turned to Mary and Dickon with a smile that glowed like light through leaves. He said that one day soon, he would run across the garden, run as freely as the wind across the moor. Mary laughed softly, full of joy and faith. Dickon nodded, not in surprise, but in steady certainty. The robin chirped sharply, as if sealing the promise. They sat together beneath the arching branches, the air warm and peaceful around them. The garden no longer felt like a hidden, sleeping place. It felt wide and bright and open, like a heart that had finally remembered how to beat. Beyond the wall, the wind carried faint sounds across the grounds. Footsteps. Soft. Near. Mary lifted her head. Dickon glanced toward the ivy. Colin paused, breath stilling in his chest. The garden fell silent. Not with fear, but with anticipation. Something, or someone, was drawing closer. Someone who had wandered far from hope. Someone whose sorrow had lived too long in darkness. Someone who did not yet know that the magic he thought lost forever was alive again. Alive, growing, waiting. Just beyond the hidden door. Chapter 26. The wind moved softly across the ivy-covered wall, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the distant echo of footsteps drawing nearer. Inside the garden, the air grew still, as though every bud, Every blade of grass, every waking rose paused to listen. Mary's heart quickened. Dickon stood quietly, his calm eyes thoughtful and alert. Colin gripped the edge of the stone bench, his breath trembling, not with fear of weakness this time, but with the strange, deep knowledge that something important was about to happen. The footsteps came closer. Slow, hesitant, uncertain. Then silence. A shadow fell across the doorway. The ivy shifted, and the hidden door began to open. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A man stepped through, tall, weary, wrapped in years of sorrow that bowed his shoulders and dimmed his eyes. His face looked older than his years, etched with grief that had never healed. But as he stood within the garden, the light touched him gently, and something inside him seemed to tremble. Mr. Archibald Craven. His gaze swept across the place he had locked away from his life. The vines, the stone paths, the tender green shoots, the quiet miracle of rebirth unfolding all around him. Memories rose like sunlight through fog, laughter, soft footsteps, a voice he had loved more than any other. His chest tightened. He felt as though he were standing in a dream he had feared to remember. Then his eyes moved forward and stopped. A boy stood in the center of the garden, not pale and fading in shadow, but standing tall beneath the sky. Alive, breathing, awake. Colin. For a long, endless moment, neither of them spoke. Their eyes locked, son and father, two hearts separated by grief, misunderstanding, and years of silent fear. Colin's lips trembled. Then, very slowly, he took a step. Not with help. Not from the chair. By himself. His body shook, but his spirit did not. He walked toward his father. The world glowed. The roses, still unopened, seemed to lean toward the moment. The robin perched on a branch above them, its bright eyes wide and shining as though it understood what was happening. Mr. Craven's breath broke from his chest, a sound of disbelief, of wonder, of a heart cracking open after years of darkness. He reached out, trembling, as if afraid the boy before him might vanish like a fading dream. Colin took another step. Then another. He stood before his father, small, fragile, brave. His voice, when he spoke, was soft and filled with quiet courage. He said he was not weak. He said he was not dying. He said he was alive, strong, growing. Just like the garden. Tears rose in Mr. Craven's eyes. Years of sorrow melted beneath them, sorrow he had clung to, sorrow that had buried his love and locked his heart away from the world. The walls he had built inside himself began to crumble, and through them flowed wonder, hope, and love. He knelt down. He took his son into his arms. Their hearts found one another again, not in grief, but in life. The wind swept softly through the branches, and the garden seemed to glow, as if the earth itself were witnessing a miracle, not of magic beyond nature, but of love returning to where it had always belonged. Mary watched with shining eyes. Dickon smiled quietly, like someone who understood that healing, like spring, comes when hearts finally remember how to open. The moor breathed softly beyond the wall. The garden stood radiant in its awakening. And in that moment, two lives that had wandered in sorrow finally stepped into the same light. But the miracle was not yet complete. For the sun had not fully reached its highest warmth, and the roses had not yet opened their bloom. Chapter 27. The sky above the moor glowed with warm, golden light, and the soft breath of spring moved gently through the waking world. Inside the secret garden, the air shimmered with quiet magic, not the magic of spells or mystery, but the deep, living magic of hearts healed, fears released, and love returned to the light. The roses had begun to bloom. Petals unfolded like bright, tender wings, blushing with soft colors that glowed beneath the sun. Vines lifted toward the sky. Grass shimmered with living green. The garden no longer felt like a place that had once slept. It felt alive, full, and whole. Mr. Craven stood beside his son. His eyes were no longer dim with sorrow. They shone with warmth, wonder, and a love he had believed he had lost forever. His heart, once locked tight like the closed garden, had opened again, just as the roses had. Colin stood proudly in the center of the garden. Not a weak boy trapped in fear, but a child filled with strength, hope, and quiet joy. He walked across the grass, steady, determined, radiant, and every step felt like a promise fulfilled. His laughter rose into the air, bright and musical, mingling with birdsong and the rustle of leaves. Mary watched him with a calm, glowing heart. She knew that the angry, lonely girl she had once been no longer existed. The garden had changed her, taught her kindness, courage, and the power of care. She had learned to love, to listen, to grow, just like the earth beneath her feet. Dickon stood nearby, peaceful and smiling, a gentle spirit rooted in sunlight and soil, as much a part of the garden as the robin perched above them. His presence felt like the moor itself, steady, warm, endlessly alive. The robin sang from a high branch, its song bright and joyful, as if it were celebrating everything the garden had become. Mr. Craven placed his hand on Colin's shoulder. His voice trembled, not with grief, but with gratitude, as he spoke softly of the years he had spent wandering in sorrow, believing only in loss. He said he had forgotten how to see life, how to hear joy, how to feel hope. The garden had brought him back. Colin lifted his face to the light. He said that the magic of the garden was not only in the leaves or the flowers or the wind, but in the courage to grow, the choice to live, and the love that binds hearts together even in their darkest moments. Mary felt those words bloom inside her like a rose opening in the sun. The world grew quiet for a moment. The air shimmered. The roses swayed gently. And it seemed as though the garden itself was listening, smiling, breathing with them. They walked together beneath the arching branches, father and son, girl and friend, no longer separated by fear, sorrow, or loneliness. The past no longer haunted them. The future no longer frightened them. They walked forward. Into sunlight. Into life. The hidden door was no longer a barrier. The garden no longer needed to hide. Because what it had healed, what it had awakened, lived not only within its walls, but within their hearts. The moor stretched wide beyond the stone and ivy, alive with wind and sky. The garden glowed softly in the warm afternoon light, its roses opening in full, radiant bloom. And as the wind drifted gently through the branches, the world whispered one final truth, a truth as timeless as the earth itself, where love is tended, where hope is nurtured, where hearts dare to grow, life will always find its way back to the light, and the secret garden would never again be silent. Thank you for listening to this story here on Your Daily Audiobook. The secret garden now stands bright and alive, its roses blooming in the sunlight, and the hearts that once lived in sadness have opened, just like the flowers on the vines. The magic of hope, kindness, and new beginnings lives on, not only inside the garden, but inside everyone who carries its message forward. May this story remind you that even the quietest places, inside us and around us, can awaken again when they are cared for with patience and love. If you enjoyed this audiobook, you're always welcome to return, because here on Your Daily Audiobook, every story is a doorway waiting to open.